Okay, now we're going to look at cutting our shapes with the Clammy. Now it's shaped like a clamshell, so that shape is pretty straightforward, but even the clamshell quilts, Glam Clam and Clam Toss, both have very specific side shapes, which I call peripheral shapes, that kind of fill out the sides of your quilt so that it's nice and square or rectangular. So I'm going to show you a little bit about just cutting with the Clammy, a few tips and tricks that'll help you along the way. The first thing we'll talk about are rotary cutters. The two rotary cutters that I use for the Clammy between 6 and 12 inch are the 28mm and the 45mm. The 28mm, if you just have the option of getting and using one, is the one that you want to get. And the reason why is because it goes around the small shapes of the 8 inch and the 6 inch Clammy. The 45mm can definitely be used for the 12 inch Clammy and for the 10 a little bit as well, but my go-to is actually the 28mm rotary cutter. So a couple of more things. Let's go ahead and move the Clammy out of the way. I want you to look at two different additional rulers that are kind of my favorites. There are a number of rulers that are great to use for this particular process for just cutting out all of the various other shapes with the Clammy. And this is a 6 inch by 12 inch ruler that's very helpful. Another one that I love is the 12.5 inch square ruler, which is really, really helpful. It's kind of the perfect size for all four Clammies. The next thing that you see right under that is this really wonderful rotating cutting mat. There's a number of cutting mats on the market. This particular brand is my favorite, and I like it because of the smooth sort of rolling action. It's a really sturdy cutting mat, so it's very stable. And it's also very thick and kind of substantial with the base underneath it, so it's really nice to have. So it's not completely necessary, but once you use it, and you'll see a little bit when we do a little bit of cutting in just a few minutes, that it really, really, really is a very useful tool, and I've definitely gotten my money out of that one. Okay, so now I'm going to pull a piece of fabric out, but let's look at the pattern really quickly. So in each of the patterns, this is the Glam Clam pattern, and each of the patterns, it's going to give you dimensions for cutting each of these kind of peripheral shapes. We're going to work with the top center. It's going to give you kind of an initial cut, and that's kind of a rectangular shape, sometimes square or rectangular shape, that you cut out first before you even pull your Clammy out. So we're playing around with a 10 inch Clammy here. So we're going to look at the initial cut is 10.5 inches by 7.25. So, oops, no, we don't need the Clammy just yet. We want to get our ruler out. So I'm going to switch that for the pattern, and we're just going to go right to that corner, and we're going to measure it 7.25 by 10.5. Just like that. Straight across. Okay, we have our first initial cut. Let's set that ruler aside. So the next thing that we're going to do is the pattern's going to tell us how to place the Clammy, where to place the Clammy on this fabric, and also what specific lines to cut. So just be careful, because you may not be cutting all of those curved lines. So the pattern tells us to place the Clammy on top. We're going to touch the bottom, the Clammy to the bottom of the fabric, and we're going to touch the two sides. Now a lot of times I'm also looking at one additional thing, and that is kind of the grid on the Clammy and whatever straight lines that we have on that fabric. So I'm looking at that line up there and making sure it lines it perfectly with the Clammy. Now the pattern tells us here it's the two highlighted yellow lines. We're just cutting these two lines, so be a little bit careful when you're kind of looking at that, because a lot of people have a tendency to want to go around the whole curve, and they chop off these corners here, which isn't ideal. So once again, I'm using that rotating cutting mat, so instead of moving physically around my mat, I'm just rotating my cutting mat so that I can cut away from me, which is of course proper cutting technique. So that's one. Let's look at the next piece, and that's two. And on that pattern, it also shows you how that final shape is supposed to look. So it looks like we did a pretty great job there. So all of the additional shapes are the same. It gives you an initial size to cut out. It tells you where to place it. It tells you to touch the sides to the top, or the sides, or just whatever is very specific to that shape, and then you can cut it out. Now cutting out the whole Clammy is just as easy, or if not easier, because we do not have to pre-cut. So Now, you will definitely want to stack and cut. Sometimes people complain it takes so long to cut them out, but I stack and cut. I put a new blade on my rotary cutter, and the only thing that you want to be concerned about when you're stacking and cutting is that your cutting technique is great. So when some people have a slight tendency to lean to one side or the other, you want to make sure that your cutting blade is perpendicular to your cutting mat, so that's straight up and down, and then you won't have a problem at all. I stack definitely 2, but sometimes 4 or 6 layers, just depending on the sharpness of my blade. Now, if you do have a tendency to lean, just be conscious of straight up and down. What will happen is, if you lean slightly, then your bottom stack will be smaller than the top of your bottom of your stack will be smaller than the top, and vice versa. If you lean that way, then the top may be a little bit smaller, and the fabric, your clams will start to grow. So just be a little conscious of that. Now we're just following along the full perimeter of that clamshell. So isn't that rotating cutting mat fabulous? Of course, proper cutting technique means we're never cutting towards ourselves or anybody else, so no cutting towards body parts. It looks like I shifted just slightly, just lining it back up perfectly. And we're cutting that last section. Look at that, we have a clamshell. That's perfect. So it's easy as that. I hope you guys have enjoyed this segment. Come back to the YouTube channel and check out all the other videos that'll be posted soon on the Clammy.